So first of all, CEFRES is celebrating its 30th anniversary, initially created to assist the rebirth of research in the social sciences and humanities following the collapse of communism in 1989. CEFRES has witnessed the recovery of academic freedom in this region after 1989. And whenever necessary, and there have been cases of challenges to academic freedom over the past 30 years, CEFRES has been on the side of the researchers and has shown solidarity. For several years now, in Poland, in Hungary, academic freedom has been regularly or even systematically challenged. For instance, in Hungary, the Viktor Orbán's government has called into question the independence of universities, dismantled the Academy of Sciences in Hungary, and pushed the Central European University outside the border of the country. In Poland, a country that I know best, the ruling party, the PiS, which is now on power, has also intensified its attacks on academic research, which has affected lawyers, sociologists, like, for example, Michał Bilewicz. Michał Bilewicz had given a lecture in 2018 at the Polin Museum in Warsaw on hate speech in contemporary Poland, and then the members of the ruling party has attacked him because he was presented another image of Poland. Historians, of course, have been more specifically targeted by the power. The Polish government's legitimate protests against the notion of Polish death camps, to refer to Nazi extermination camps on the territory of Poland, have led the ruling conservatives to legislate, to legislate against academic freedom. An entire field of research on Polish-Jew relations during the Second World War, and in particular on the role of Poles in the pogroms perpetrated during this period. And this is a research which has been very much developed and even became institutionalized over the last 2 decades. In fact, suddenly became criminalized in Poland. And researchers, well-known researchers who are famous all over the world, like Barbara Engelking or Jan Grabowski, have even been recently convicted by a Warsaw court. Generally speaking, these political and direct challenges to academic freedom are part of a more general and undoubtedly more pernicious context of managerialization, liberalization of research itself, the effects of which on intellectual autonomy must also be questioned. It is for these reasons that we wanted to place our 30th anniversary under the sign of academic freedom. So some weeks ago, we organized an international conference in Prague on power, knowledge, and academic freedom, which gave rise to an official speech on academic freedom by Mr. Clément Beaune, Secretary of State for European Affairs in the French government, for instance. And our main witness was Mr. Mikhail Ignatieff, who is the rector and president of the CEU, Central European University, who reminded us the importance, but also the fragility of academic freedom seen as a professional freedom, a professional right, the challenge of which is to popularize this academic freedom outside the academic circles, outside university. In the 2 countries I mentioned, Hungary and Poland, gender studies are also targeted by the parties in power in different ways. Of course, it's not completely the same situation, but in those 2 countries, gender studies are presented there not as a science, but as an ideology, in a curious reversal of the status of Marxist-Leninism during communism, I would say, because it was an ideology, but presented as a science at that time. Today in these 2 countries, the holders of power disqualify gender studies, presented as a form of ideological colonialism, which would be antinomic to the idea that conservatives and nationalists have of Polish identity or Hungarian identity. In Poland, for instance, to be a good Pole is to be Catholic and heterosexual, let's say. And in fact, gender studies have become the usual target of a political strategy that claims to be based on common sense, normality, and a particular conception of the nation. And as we can see, of course, these challenges are not limited to the academic field. They are part of a more general offensive against freedoms, in particular, but not only sexual freedoms. I am sure that this roundtable will help us understand the reasons for this, and we will also reveal the links between the different dimensions of this phenomenon. In a logic of international comparison, that's why I'm very happy that we will talk about Hungary and maybe about also the other countries in the region, but not only, and we will propose a comparison between different spaces in the world today. So I'm very delighted about this roundtable, and I thank you again, all the participants. And I'm giving now the floor to Delphine Lacombe and Marième Ndiaye.
Thank you very much, Jérôme. Thank you very much for this introduction from the CEFRES. Dear colleagues and participants, we're very pleased to co-organize with the French Research Center for Humanities and Social Sciences and the CEMCA, the Center for Mexican and Central American Studies, this webinar too. We want to inaugurate a series of upcoming activities between l'Institut du Genre and the French research units abroad, as Jérôme told us. The Gender Institute is a scientific group which was created almost 10 years ago in France. Its aim is to promote and disseminate research on gender in all its diversity, in particular for young researchers, and to support the scientific recognition. More recently, the Institute has decided to strengthen this, its international dimension by setting up a network of correspondents. We wanted to rely on the network of French research units abroad and on the very rich connections with colleagues in the countries where they are based. So, and the Institute of Research for Development is also part of this dynamic. The objective is to make regional meetings online about the main political issues on gender, taking into account the very contrasting political context around common themes. We would like to thank also Jérôme Heurtaux for the CEFRES and Bernard Talley from the CEMCA for the partnership in this session. And today we also celebrate the CEFRES 30th anniversary. So on this occasion, we wish the CEFRES a happy birthday.
Thank you.
So as Jérôme said, this first webinar focuses on the relationship between gender, and more precisely gender studies, political conflict, and academic freedom. The topic is vast and complex, and it is not our ambition to exhaust it in this short introduction. But during these 2 hours, we would like to give with our guests some elements to understand the actuality of this question in a very different context. We would like to discuss the current development of the conservative backlash against gender studies, the forms of pressure and censorship against them, depending on the political context. In Europe, there are several examples, to varying degrees, of attacks, censorship, or discrediting of gender studies, which shows the radicalization of the backlash. So, as Jérôme said, one of the most striking situations in terms of political decision is that of the Hungarian government of Viktor Orbán, who revoked the accreditation of the country's 2 master's degree programs in gender studies in October 2018. And most recently, on June 7, 2021, 262 Danish academic experts in gender and migration studies mobilized to defend academic freedom after a majority of MPs passed a motion demanding that politics should not be disguised as science. In their tribune, the researchers mentioned Frédéric Vidal, the French Minister of Higher Education and Research, whose words, they said, have served as a direct model for Danish politicians, whom they accuse of endangering academic freedom in the kingdom. In February 2021, Frédéric Vidal, in a television interview, voluntarily conflated post- and decolonial studies, intersectionality, gender studies, and a so-called Islamo-leftism. She indicated that I quote, the university was not impervious to the Islamo-leftist gangrene that affects France. And she then asked the National Center for Scientific Research for an investigation about these approaches in order to separate militancy and scientific work. The CNRS refused to prepare any assessment on the matter. And recently, the Council of State, which is the supreme administrative jurisdiction in the country, qualified the minister's request as an abuse of power. One also thinks of the declaration of the French Minister of Education, considering that, I quote, intersectional theses in France are the breeding ground for a fragmentation of our society and a vision of the world that converges with the interest of Islamists. In the French case, it is not the gender studies that are directly and exclusively targeted, but a set of critical approaches amalgamated around Islamo-leftism, post-colonialism, and intersectional studies.
And elsewhere in the world, censorship exists in various forms. And even if the pressure does not always come from the state itself, gender studies and scholars are generally targeted as vehicles of what its detractors call gender ideology, as a symbolic glue, as Andrea Pető demonstrated. Thus, gender remains highly political and linked to the question of national identity. It should be remembered that this conflictuality often goes beyond both the traditional partisan cleavages and the divide between religious and secular spaces. In Latin America, for example, political leaders as different as Jair Bolsonaro, Rafael Correa, or Evo Morales castigated gender and gender studies. It is important to remember how the dissemination of gender studies or gender grammar in different places has raised strong criticism from feminism itself. Historically, some of its currents feared that a new paradigm strongly influenced by the United States would de-radicalize feminist activism or separate it from its logical articulations with Marxist thought. So the question of the bridges between gender studies, feminism, and LGBT movements and the institutions dedicated to gender equality has become a very important issue. Let us also specify that the university world remains a battlefield for intellectuals, students, and academics who sometimes confront each other with radical practices leading to censorship or self-censorship. It's exceptional, but it does exist. So this question is a challenge to imagine strategies to build spaces for open and plural debates while the anti-gender movements are more and more organized. On the conservative side, on the contrary, the so-called gender ideology was castigated after the Cold War as a new Marxist ideology supplanting the class struggle. For example, in Central America, I studied this phenomenon after the civil wars confronted revolutionary and counter-revolutionary movements. This opposition to gender became extremely present and quite organized from the very early 1990s at the time of the Cairo and Beijing conferences. In the Global South, academic freedom can be measured through the capacity of gender studies to be recognized as a scientific critical approach and not as a depoliticized field of research systematically indexed to development or UN agency. For example, many African feminist scholars regret that the concept of gender is rarely used in its philosophical and political sense. The African academic departments often use gender and women's gender and development or gender sexuality and women's studies as their moniker for institutionalization.
So today we would like to discuss these various issues by putting into perspective different spaces and temporalities. With Andrea Pető, a leading specialist of these issues, professor at the Central European University, we will return to the Hungarian situation that she defines as an illiberal polypore state. With Patrick Awondo, professor at the University of Yaoundé, specialist in homophobic and anti-gender mobilization in Africa, we will understand what academic freedom does to gender as a subject of research in Cameroon. And finally, we will listen to Verónica Rodriguez Cabrera, professor at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana-Xochimilco in Mexico. She works on public policy regarding violence against women, and her presentation is entitled Academic Freedom and Gender Studies, the Question of Violence Against Women. And finally, David Paternotte is professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He is an eminent specialist in anti-gender movements in Europe, and he is also a member of the International Scientific Council of the Institut du Genre. He will be the moderator of the roundtable and will comment the different interventions. So thanks again to all of you for your participation. And before beginning, a precision on the organization of the chat. You will be able to write your question and comment within the thread, and we will pass it on to the speakers after the intervention. And of course, we will have a time for discussion after these three interventions. So first, we give the floor to Andrea Pető. You have between 15 and 20 minutes maximum in order to let time for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and thank you very much for all the support what you have received from CEFRES in the difficult years, and also your support for gender studies. And I mean, we have lost. I mean, that happens, and but there is another. There will be another day, right? As we know from the term. So what I would like to do today is giving a short analysis and then some suggestions. What shall we do in the future, right? I actually wrote this up just to make sure that I keep the 15 minutes and I try to present it as clearly as possible. So thanks again for the invitation. And I would like to start with an opening story. So who do you think the most well-known and widely translated German gender sociologist is in East Central Europe? Before you start guessing, the answer is Gabriele Kubi, who labels gender studies, I quote, culture of death. Kubi gives book talks through Central Europe and was appointed a professor in Hungary as, I quote, a well-known German sociologist, end quote, at one of the newly founded, lavishly founded state universities in the picturesque city of Sümek. More importantly, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, listed Kubi's book entitled The Global Sexual Revolution, published in 2015, as an important book on his bookshelf and referred to it in an interview he gave to the online magazine Politico in November 2015 about the future of illiberal Europe. The book has been translated to several languages besides Polish, Hungarian, Slovak, Romanian, Croatian, Czech, and English. Kubi is an author of 12 books, is an outsider to German sociology, as both an academic discipline and profession, will be affecting the development of discipline in the future. She has a wider outreach than most of her colleagues, as her books are downloadable freely in the local languages, including Hungarian, from Catholic websites, and her views are mainstreamed into religious educational institutions, which are increasing by number day by day as the state withdraws from public spending in education and recently from orphanages. Unfortunately, Kubi is one representative of a global transnational movement of scholars who are labeling gender studies as, I quote, culture of death, and labeling feminists as suppressing men. She's also a part of this anti-equality movement, organizing demonstrations and successful referenda against universal human rights, such as in Slovenia against gay marriage. It is also clear that the elimination of the 2-year accredited master's program in gender studies from the accredited study list without any consultation with any stakeholders in Hungary did not come from nowhere. Several new challenges are in the area of gender studies scholar in Europe are clearly demonstrated in this introductory story. The anti-gender movements attacking gender studies as an academic discipline are gaining much public and state support in today's Europe. In Poland, no project proposal or educational program is eligible for state funding, which mentions the term gender. In Romania, due to the protest, this attempt was cancelled. But recently in Denmark and in France are becoming frontline countries in defending gender studies. I'm arguing that these anti-gender movements are not only moving in piggybacking the still conveniently popular anti-feminist sentiments and rhetorics, as the argument of the women's activists oppressing men goes back to the period of the suffrage movement, but they are substantially different. Gender studies developed as an interdisciplinary critical discipline with relatively late institutionalization. In an increasingly shrinking academic job market, due to the continuous cuts in social sciences and humanities, gender studies have been an easy target. Recently, the main battleground for the so-called anti-gender movements has been the objective science as we know it from the Enlightenment. As Roman Kuhar, the Slovenian sociologist, convincingly argued in his analysis of these developments in Slovenia and Croatia, the anti-gender movement's use of so-called scientific evidence against what they call gender ideology means a paradigm change in science. Any scientific data can be contested based on a normative solution. Any scientific data can be contested based on a normative moral position. The ad hoc selection of scientific data in order to prove an ideologically important point became a common practice. This means anybody can now represent himself, herself as an expert, as Gabriele Kubi, the heroine of the introductory story, does, especially if shady state foundations are supporting higher educational institutions, such as the case in Hungary with the Pallas Athena and other shady foundations, which are taking over the de-invested Hungarian higher education. Thus, gender studies and the knowledge it produces about society and culture are now being re-evaluated. Indeed, in Poland, institutions lose their funding if gender is mentioned in a job or a project application. The institutional and academic vulnerability of gender studies is increasing because of the re-evaluation of its position in the field of science as such. This new normal, the illiberalism, should not be perceived as a revival of authoritarianism, but rather a new form of governance, resting on previous democratic concepts and institutions, and one that can be better understood when one goes beyond routine comparative analysis of political systems along the East-West divide, and instead traces the gradual socio-political developments in these countries by placing them in the context of broader global processes. Born of disillusionments with globalized neoliberal democracy, the liberal regimes seem to provide solutions to its emergent problems. And here, gender serves as a symbolic glue, and it becomes the center of their political communication. In that context, gender serves as a symbolic glue that glues together different actors, movements, and values with the glue of hate and exclusion while offering an alternative to neoliberalism. Due to this so-called anti-gender campaign, gender studies knowledge production has changed forever, as gender studies has become a popular science. Politicians, we heard in the introduction, public intellectuals, or anybody just on Facebook with a Facebook account are making self-assured and authoritative public statements on professional issues such as sex education or curriculum of master's studies without any knowledge or training in gender studies. As Sara Garbagnoli has pointed out, books of Judith Butler and other gender studies scholars are now shelved in bookshops right next to anti-gender volumes, as they had the same scientific weight in gender studies. So this is happening paradoxically during the resurgence of credibility of science and experts because of the global pandemic. This revival of trust in science has not remained undetected by illiberal actors, leading to illiberal state officials applying the very same toolkit of science in their fight against gender studies by citing hodgepodge surveys in an ad hoc manner, which allows them to undermine the relevance of gender research and its empirical findings, as well as the values and legitimacy of its scientific endeavors in general. So what kind of strategies are possible in this new academic climate? What can all those gender studies scholars do when their fields, their work, their publications are labeled not only worthless and useless, but also dangerous, and they cannot or do not want to emigrate to where the shrinking global academic space will soon not offer academic employment anymore? As the authentic study of gender studies is blocked by science policy, so-called science policy of the liberal states, and the study of family policy as a scientific endeavor and the professional life belt has been established, many scholars have seemingly resurfaced as experts in family policy or family studies. This follows the development in Russian gender studies, where gender studies programs are becoming family studies programs. So this is the strategy of adaptation. It's well known to middle-aged intellectuals from the communist era. One may pursue a career and publish only if one is not openly against the regime. Corvinus University of Economics and Business in Budapest, one of the first privatized institutions in Hungary, was formerly a gender studies pioneer through the work of its sociology department. The very first gender studies center was founded there, and a stream of young gender-sensitive political and social scientists graduated from it. A new English language MA in Economics of Family Policy and Public Policies for Human Development has now been established there as a part of the government's family mainstreaming concept, with the contribution of the most well-known feminist experts. In Poland, women's studies and research on women have experienced a new revival, not without theoretical and political risks. The strategy of separation, this is the other strategy, the strategy of separation to found new institutions and academies outside the already existing framework. We see this, how it worked in the case of the University of Theatre and Film, which founded its own NGO, and now they are continuing to their classes in the former buildings of the CEU. The third strategy is the naming and shaming, which is applied by some gender studies scholars concerning what is considered scientific by whom has so far only achieved partial success, as ridiculing the views of the anti-gender movement only gives them more visibility and rhetorical space and points of identifications for possible followers, as the elitist labeling them as those I quote, who do know what gender really is, end quote, opens up a space for contestation. Moreover, in some cases, these efforts have only amounted to a deepening of political cleavages without yielding any real understanding of the depths of the threat to the infrastructure of human rights, including institutionalized gender studies, and especially without offering new methods or rhetoric in support of progressive politics as regards both what has been achieved and how to move forward. It is a political imperative to recognize that this so-called anti-gender studies mobilization is a hegemonic fight in the Gramscian sense for control. The institutionalized gender studies developed in the liberal paradigm, in some cases keeping critical distance. However, the emergence of illiberal democracies and closing societies are offering a livable, viable alternative to liberal democracies. Therefore, attacks on gender studies as a discipline and as institutions producing knowledge are equal with attacks on liberal democracy. This is the fight gender studies scholars cannot afford to lose, because that means losing the concept of equality as we know it. To sum up, gender studies as an academic discipline found its, to use Eric Fassen's term, paradoxical recognition via the attacks of illiberal forces. This institutional and academic vulnerability of gender studies is increasing because of re-evaluation of their position in the field of science. Government propaganda has deliberately undermined the social and symbolic legitimation of gender studies, which has only exacerbated the panic and bitterness felt among those who involved. The European scientific infrastructure was unprepared for the emergence of this illiberal science policy and the illiberal scientific institutions. This is clearly illustrated by the fact that the Hungarian Accreditation Committee obtained its European license, the ENQA, the European Network for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, only after CEU was forced into exile and the 2-year master's program in gender studies was stricken from the accredited study list. These illiberal institutions use the neoliberal language of excellence, competitiveness, impact, social outreach, indices to achieve their purpose. According to the recent report by Scholars at Risk, I quote, academic freedom is not acknowledged in any of the influential university rankings. As a reference point for scholars, university administrators, and governments, data sets such as the Shanghai ranking, the Higher Education World University ranking, the QS World University ranking, or the U multi-rank are in a unique position to improve academic freedom by altering incentive structures for students, scholars, universities, and governments. End quote. It is questionable, however, if bringing in academic freedom as an index in the neoliberal rankings would contribute to a meaningful change. Gender studies as an academic discipline found its, I quote, paradoxical recognition via and by the attacks by the liberal forces. Time will show if it presents reactivity can be transformed to proactivity for the sake of a better science for all. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start thanking you for the invitation and celebrating this webinar, and also congratulations for your 30th anniversary. I'm pleased to be here to sharing with you some ideas on the relationship between academia and political struggle, taking into account the case of Mexico. The name of my presentation, I'm going to share my screen because I prepared something that is quite simple. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes,
now.
we can see it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fine.
Thank you. So, the presentation that I'm going to share with you is called Academic Freedom and Gender Studies, the Question of Violence Against Women in Mexico. Well, gender studies in Mexico have been dispersed slowly and with many difficulties. In fact, the researchers who were interested in these topics have to incorporate them marginally in traditional disciplines, fields, and research areas, as well as their daily teaching and their promotion of cultural activities. All of them have to face a climate of resistance with regard to considering gender issues only as a perspective or as a matter of study and research. They were until involved in justifying research and teaching topics related to gender troubles, and to find other voices that make echo or bring a support to them is very complex. Even they have to deal with the disqualification statements about the advance and imposition of a point of view. In fact, there have been many ways to prevent and deny feminist agenda and gender studies in the academy. Researchers and activists have to manage to rise from the bottom, being pioneers into the academy, generating spaces for discussion and analysis, opening new fields of knowledge and research, and propose educational programs that have been made an important impact in Mexico as well in Latin America. Such as are the case of these programs that I'm just putting in the slide. All of them were formed by militants of the 70s movement, women's movement, who joined the academic work in universities and colleges. Women whose principal interest were looking to give theoretical and academic support to the subordination of women. Those studies programs began giving lessons and courses and organizing seminars that with time, they became institutional postgraduate programs. All of them with an increasing demand that was attended by few hands. We can make a parallel with the first wave of feminism. I'm making this kind of image that the academy in Mexico is similar with the different waves of feminism. The second wave identified in the academy were gradually expanded, taking into account topics related to making visible the inequality among women, such as sexual and reproductive health, unfair working conditions, abortion laws, women's rights, among other themes that focus on the specificity of being women in patriarchal societies, such as Mexico. From this perspective, some critical academics pointed out the recognition of the diversity and women and gender identities and representations, especially among indigenous people, poor and exploited workers, sexual diversity, disabled and vulnerable corporalities, among others. Those topics have produced a wide range of intersectional studies that cover approaches as the colonial, diversities, queer, creep, masculinities, bodies and corporal studies, shaping new fields of knowledge and research and teaching. We can say feminist and women studies in Mexico began to be wide and spread, consolidating a kind of third wave. These are the symbol or the logos, the symbols of the different programs in Mexico. There are more, but I just pictured this. However, taking in account the great diversity of feminist and women studies in Mexico, it is expected that some problematic issues arrive among academics, especially for those who find a way to make gains and profits from the field, as well as the differences and counterpoints within academics and activists. Today, the current wave recover claims used to be related to corporal and daily life experiences, such as abortion, labor rights, equality in politics, as well as violence against women. For more than a decade, this last team has brought together all the feminist voices. Violence against women and gender-based violence is a problem that has been claimed thousands of women's lives in Mexico. It is estimated that between 9 and 11 women are murdered every day in the country, without taking into account the people whose bodies are not attached to heteronormative and patriarchal boundaries and suffer different manifestations of gender-based violence. In March 8th of 2019, the largest protests against this problem take place in the country. Rape, harassment, sexual violence, disappearance, feminicide became the pointed light of the struggle. As the slide shows, hundreds of thousands of women march painting of purple the capital and the main cities. In colleges, women's studies demonstrate that this problem is also present in campuses. Like a Pandora box, they unveil that gender-based violence has been little taken into account in universities. Violence against women have captured attention since the most vulnerable groups have emerged into radical demonstrations to denounce the teaching practices that normalize sexual violence in the classrooms. And also, on the other hand, the conservative discourses arise that back on the criticism of the violent character that the protests are taking form, in order to undermine and dismiss the activism. Taking over faculties, making strikes, organizing protests, and taking action in the public sphere, young scholars decide to break the silence and demand that academic institutions take measures for attending this problem. I have to mention that the Mexican universities has a lack of gender perspective in their practices and management. For this reason, and from several fronts, activism, academics, as well as other people in these communities have to manage to materialize quick and fundamental changes. For example, at Xochimilco, where I work for, it has been possible to place the topic as part of the introduction program at the university, as well as to have a special office for attention and guide victims throughout the process of making complaints. At the institutional level, regulation and procedures are changing, incorporating gender mainstreaming, and looking forward to embracing broad focus and open minds in order to harmonize the legislation and regulations with the national laws and international agreements that Mexico have signed in this matter. In addition, the UAM has created an unusual transversal policy in the aim to eradicate gender-based violence, which it involves guaranteeing conditions for achieving equity and in research and teaching, create incentives that look forward to contribute to cultural changes related to women and gender issues in campuses, assure human and financial planning for the advance of specific programs, the realization of awareness activities, permanent training on topics of the feminist agenda, political equity, and institutional management, to mention some. All of those are huge changes that are being challenged in the future. Maybe that's why the fear and opposition to the adoption of these changes are once and again become a battlefield. By those who believe that the incorporation of this knowledge in the academy divides positions, radicalizes people by making them intolerant, and generates fear among those who deny the contributions of feminism. For the academic who are working at the front of the line, that means to be in an eye of the hurricane, in the sense that from a space of privilege, they try to drive and conduct changes without a challenge. And what about the cost? Women in academics have reported overburdening as their role as specialists among few. They face precarity in their development of the research. They are not being valued by their efforts, as well as the lack of reinforcements throughout the difficulties of bringing new generations into academics. due to the labor conditions in Mexico. Let me remind you that there are few programs that are open to introduce this knowledge in their fields, as well as they have to face the continuous continuity where they are pointed out as troublemakers and stubborn people. To conclude, I will say that academic freedom is a necessary condition to promote education and produce knowledge in accordance with the problems that affect our societies. Such freedom is an essential factor to develop new paradigmatic situations. Thank you very much.
In this communication, I had announced that I will dwell on gender as a research subject and career choice. On the one hand, to sketch out lines of reflection about its practice, its consequences for the freedom and autonomy of researcher. On the other hand, to give an understanding of two striking facts that are more than just a hypothesis in the context. Firstly, the fact that gender appears in the Cameroonian university context too often as a taboo area when it is not part of the development perspective, like you mentioned it on your introduction. On the other hand, the recent shift in its meaning, its extension to sexual identities and pluralities are more than ever contested as legitimate ground for the country and even for Africa. As a result, in many cases, gender researchers and academics are seen as traitor to the culture, with the direct consequence of constant injunction to change their field of research. And therefore, the commitment to gender is in this sense a commitment to isolation and a constant fight for the freedom to research on gender. So my exercise is simple. I will try to describe, growing on my own experience and that of others, often young Cameroonian academics, the way in which academic mobility is constituted as the condition for autonomy. That will be my conclusion. But let me first come back to the context. Overall, in Cameroon, there is a very, very little institutionalization of gender studies. The Cameroonian University, like some of its African counterparts in sub-Saharan Africa, is now 50 years old, but gender studies have remained globally non-existent in curricula. Of course, this can be different depending on the area of Africa where you are situated. It's not exactly the case in Anglophone and South African countries, but in countries like Cameroon and globally in Central and West Africa, gender studies have remained underdeveloped. Here and there, in some department in history or sociology, following the feminist push of the 70s and 80s, and the access of some women to some university position, there is a course on women and society in Africa, or women in the colonial area in some history department, women and gender studies in some sociology department. Among the 8 state universities in Cameroon, there are a few departments of gender studies. The University of Buea in the Anglophone English-speaking zone is, I think, the only university that hosts the Department of Women and Gender Studies. In my own university, in Yaoundé 1, the sociology department hosts a master in gender and development. So it's a very professional master. So there is a very low commitment to the gendered political and philosophical issues. The reason for this are well known and have already been mentioned by you when you were introducing the workshop, but also by the other panelists. But in the case of Africa, there is, I think, the work of Fatou Sow that is worth mentioning for the kind of investigation and global reflection she has on the reason why gender studies are less developed in the context. The first reason she is that, and she also mentioned it, there is a vassalization of women in the male political movement. There was vassalization of women in the male political movement since decolonization. That gave rise to them after independence. This led to political and militant orientation that often echoed the priorities of men in movements such as Pan-Africanism, socialism, and anti-colonialism, to the detriment of women's project and gender. This prioritization still operates in the same way today, especially as the lack of institutionalization of gender studies means that there is not enough critical mass within university to reverse this trend. Administration keeps saying development is the only valuable goal. So whenever you want to address gender, you need to incorporate that in development issues. There is also the problem of the competence of researchers and teachers specialized in gender and then therefore capable of filling the gap in university institution, but also of providing quality training on gender and its new dynamics. For instance, at University of Yaoundé 1, the gender master I mentioned before at Department of Sociology is coordinated by a female lecturer who is not specialized in gender studies. She never, ever produced a paper on gender studies. But whose legitimacy is based on the fact that she was practically the only female lecturer in the department at the time the master's degree was created. So in her case, biological predetermination takes advantage on the criterion of competence. And as one a Cameroonian historian said in an article on the teaching of gender history in Cameroon, seniority and masculinity get the choice, of course, in almost all the university. Two things that can relegate women to the rank of eternal social cadets. Other factors relating to hegemonic masculinities and traditional patriarchy fuel negative representation of gender studies in the country's university. As a lecturer in University of Yaoundé 1, I have always been struck by the violence of the comment of colleagues when feminism and the need for a more open university to its perspective is discussed. And two types of argument are systematically opposed. Those arguments link first of all to what I can call uncredible patriarchy that characterizes the discourse of public intellectual in the context. It's something like the kind of uncredible racism that we can observe in European and Western context since a decade. Feminism and other current cannot be allowed to take hold, as a colleague of political science told me, because it tends to reverse the social order and to issue men. So as Fatou so pointed out, as a woman speaking in public against men in Africa, this means being against Africa and against cultural violence. So this is one of the major arguments you always heard about in universities whenever you talk about feminism. Another figure of the trial is directly related to the backlash linked to the recent visibility of homosexuality and sexual minority. As a reminder, since the turn of the 2000, there have been numerous controversies, which, although they have led to a debate on the status of homosexuality, which is still prohibited in the country, have made it possible to lift the taboo on this sexual orientation. Since this turning point, developing gender studies will mean giving into an international gay agenda, an argument that is globally well discussed since Massad studies. So in short, the anti-gender protest of the last 2 decades has canceled out all efforts, including in the academic field in the Cameroonian context. Do I still have some more minutes? How many time do I have?
You have 5 minutes, Patrick.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
8 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So among the recent facts, there are also the recurrent public polemics on the homosexual question and sexual minorities, on which the academic position, including here feminists, I mean, those who claim to be feminists in the context, remain rather ambivalent when they are not even in a logic of open opposition against these minorities for fear of stigmatization and backlash on their own action as feminists or simply as women. Two examples here quickly. In 2009, a feminist group joined a march against homosexuality, organized by what was then an organization reaching to the World Day Against Homophobia. More recently, in 2018, the textbook affair, with the withdrawal of a high school textbook for apology of homosexuality, even if the book was in fact stigmatizing this sexual orientation, has in any case forced academics to speak out, particularly academic women. And not surprisingly, many of them spoke out in favor of the protection of traditional value. So all this has the effect of seriously limiting the rise of gender studies. And from the personal experience, I have many students who want to work on women issues, but are told by their supervisor and their friend not to mention feminism. So you can study women's condition, but never mention feminism. This kind of ometa act in the same way on work on sexual minorities and homosexuality. Many students are threatened with exclusion from departments such as sociology, history, and even education, science education, if they insist on working on gender issues. Young people who want to engage in gender studies are accused of being traitor to the culture and playing into the hands of imperialism. So even if David does not like the term backlash, we must recognize that there is a backlash on the emergence of work on sexual minorities and women studies and gender studies more generally in the Cameroonian University. So in this context, what can we do to study gender and to think gender. My position is that the only way to escape the perverse effect of anti-gender and patriarchy in Cameroonian and other African universities right now is through academic mobility. How does it work? We need to strengthen our global alliance, just the way the anti-gender are doing at the moment, to help those who face those challenging contexts to work to at least publicize what they are experiencing abroad, so that those arguments can come back in their context. Thank you.
Now, are you ready, David?
I would like to start with two stories, which are, I think my whole comments will be very much influenced by the European context. So I'm sorry for being Eurocentric, and especially the context of attacks on academic freedom. And I know that Delphine, among others, attended a conference that was organized in Paris by Eric Fassin and Caroline Ibos last week on exactly the same topic, where I also explain why sometimes I have doubts about the way it is framed. So I will repeat those doubts today about how we think about those issues. And the other thing is, it's also very much that what I say is influenced by my own positionality. For some reasons to be further investigated, Belgium it's not suffering a lot from anti-gender attacks. There are things, but at the moment there are not many. It can change very easily. We have seen that across Europe, including in places like the Netherlands, for instance, at the moment, or Scandinavia, but at the moment it's not the case. And because of that, compared to, and especially when I was listening to some of the stories, especially from Verónica and Patrick, our situation is a bit different because institutionalization is very recent, as also in Belgium, as Andrea mentioned, it's very, very recent. We have still not many resources, and departments with far less students have much more professors than we do in gender studies. So you still see those kind of balance, but at the same time, we have political access. I have a long list of titles on my email, too many, but it means that I can go to the boss of my university. I'm myself vice dean for international relations. So, and I can also interpellate the minister, something I do for the master in gender studies. So the situation is a bit different. And I think all situations just lead me to all these elements to ask other questions, and I will ask 5 critical questions. But just before that, I will tell 2 short stories. I do like Andrea. I will not do a guess, but also one is a text that just arrived in my mailbox from the United States this afternoon. And just part of this email that, it's not a personal email, it's just a general thing that came together. And it starts by, we must preserve freedom on campus. The future of freedom depends on it. Free speech is a pillar of American democracy, and it is the lifeblood of college campuses. A college campus is supposed to be the marketplace of ideas, a home to free thinking. So it doesn't come from CEU, but it could. No, I read the rest of the text. But many campuses discriminate against and censor Christian and conservative voices. Yet more and more, the First Amendment rights of religious schools and students of faith on public college campuses are under threat. In some cases, the threats aim to drive religious schools out of existence. In others, they seek to silence students of faith. Shuttering Christian colleges and universities and marginalizing Christian and conservative students on public campuses isn't a victory for diversity. It's a loss for all Americans. So you may imagine it comes from a right-wing organization. It comes actually from ADF International, so one of the most important anti-gender organizations in the world and in Europe. It's actually a global organization, although it comes from the US, which is connected to the pro-Christian right. And you may also know that the same organization is at the moment promoting new legislation in the UK through the Johnson government to protect freedom of speech on campus, which means protecting conservative on campus. You may also know that the Polish government has announced a few days ago that they will also develop new regulations to protect academic freedom. So we're all very happy that the Polish government is protecting academic freedom. And actually, my second story is from Poland. It's from Warsaw. At the end of May, a new university was born in Warsaw. So I'm sure you find that an excellent news. When you look at the content of what they do, it's not that excellent. So this new institution is called Collegium Intermarium. It's established by the ultra-conservative organization Otto Juris, the same organization that is fighting abortion and LGBT rights in Poland. And you have lots of people. At the inauguration, you had one of my colleagues from the ULB, the professor of Roman history, who is still at ULB because he's protected by academic freedom. And what they teach is law. It is very good to form lawyers and litigate against human rights, both in Polish and English. They have a master in family policy in local authorities. They have another master in management of non-governmental organizations. They have obviously a master in classical Europe. And now they have just added a master in modern forensic methods. What I tell you is very interesting, new university, new program, something different. And I think it's very close to what Andrea mentioned with this idea of polypore university, polypore state, but also polypore university. And I think it really makes a connection. And all that, there could be many other stories. Just lead me to ask 5 questions and to remind first that when we tried in the book on anti-gender movement, in which Andrea has also a chapter, we proposed the term anti-gender, whatever campaigns or activism, whatever you call, because we wanted to differentiate it from other forms of opposition to gender, gender studies, LGBT rights, women's rights. We wanted to emphasize the newness, the specificity of what is happening. And personally, but that's very personal, I've always been really reluctant to use concepts like patriarchy, especially because it ignores history and it ignores changes over time. As it always be the same. And for instance, when I was listening to Verónica and Patrick, I was wondering, what is this new wave? What is an older wave? How do they connect? Are we facing one form of opposition, different forms of opposition? How do we articulate them? And even the Catholic Church, which is obviously an old actor, has developed new strategies to address those. And all these lead to my 5 questions. The first question, I think Andrea has already answered a lot to that, is we disconnect gender and gender studies from other domains of research and other domains of life than university. In other words, can we think about the tax on gender studies without thinking about the tax on other things in universities and also on other things outside of universities? And I think that has been already discussed a lot. The second question is, Patrick was mentioning again that I don't like the concept of backlash. And I think, really my main concern is that by focusing so much on attacks, on what is destroyed, we do not focus enough on what is constructed. And just before that, I was at the presentation of a report when I had also to make comments by Nil Data on funding of anti-gender activism in Europe. And he has a great quote in the conclusion, which I think really summarizes what I trying to say. It's a quote from Picasso. I don't know anything about the context, but that says every act of creation is first an act of destruction. And from Andrea, especially that, for instance, Viktor Orban is not only destroying universities, and Andrea has reminded that today, he's constructing a lot. He's actually a builder in terms of academic life. You can say academic life with a lot of precautions, but he's building. He's not only destroying what existed. And I think this is something to keep in mind to try to think what's happening today around academic freedom. It brings me to a third question, is what is critical thought? And especially that comes from the Paris conference last week. One of the major frames is that it's an attack on academic freedom. And myself, I was repeating that. However, I would say, and if you read Gabriele Kubi that Andrea mentioned, it would be clear, what is critical and who is critical today? Are we still critical as other people or not? You may know that now in all the things funded by European money for research, you will have the obligation, you have more gender obligations. So is it still critical when, for instance, all the institutions receiving European money will need to have a gender equality plan as an institution of higher education, for instance? And it will be very interesting to see how it happens in institutions of Polish university, for instance. So what is critical? Who is critical? Are we critical forever? Is gender a critical concept forever? Are gender studies critical forever, for instance? And I don't know, it's the real question, but I think something we should unpack and discuss. The fourth question is academic freedom sufficient as an analytical frame and as a strategy of action? And as I told you, one of the reasons why my colleague who teaches history of Roman Empire is still a member of my university and a colleague is because he's defended by academic freedom, although now he's one of the intellectuals in court in Warsaw and Budapest. So is academic freedom sufficient? And I don't know. And finally, and this is really just to a provocation, is science going to save us? Will the truth finally emerge out of darkness? Or are we going to stay in darkness forever? And is science going to save us from darkness? In other terms, is good science going to help us? And I think Andrea has already mentioned how the liberal science, or the science promoted by the EU, for instance, was not ready for that sort of attack. So is it enough just to think that good science will prevail and in the end, it will work? And these are just questions to make you think and answer. I don't have the answers to the questions, so it's really not the point to come with a definite answer to that, but just to be provocative.
So maybe we'll let the three speakers react and answer.
I think you are very right. What we need to do is question the orthodoxies and the previous systems of truth, because at the moment we are at the crossroad. And unfortunately, this paradoxical recognition of, to again use Eric Fassin's term, came late. So in a sense that if the integration and the acceptance of this kind of critical thinking had happened, really, then we would not be in this serious trouble. But this is a kind of Coelho type of wisdom. But I would like to maybe emphasize as a conclusion that usually the progressive actors are underestimating the illiberal actors, and because of the belief that they still have the hegemony and still have the position to make this kind of statements. And they do not recognize that this kind of new illiberal world order, which is actually building out in our eyes as we speak, is actually a coherent, well thought, well conceptualized, and really very carefully considered system of values and institutions. You might very legitimately say that this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but what I would like to underline here is this point what David made about the ADF, which is this international organization, which is basically coordinating all those anti-gender attacks in all over globally. So I find this particularly interesting because this fight against gender studies and liberalism is happening in the national context and very often in the local context. If you think about the kind of gay-free zones in Poland, which was allegedly an initiative of the different municipals, but actually it was initiated by somebody who was with a suitcase traveling from one municipal to another in Poland and made an offer to certain mayors, and some mayors said okay, some mayors and put up this LGBTQI free zone statements on their webpage. Some said no, some rewrote this statement, but definitely it happened on the local level. And here I would like to somehow connect what Patrick was saying, that the international cooperation will somehow solve this problem. I think this is more complicated than that. There's these three different layers: the local, the national, and the international, the transnational, is somehow merged together and not really connected, because all these countries are actually taking the pride of being very national, and they are fighting against the foreign influence, while at the same time they are adopting an international know-how. So this is basically like if somebody would argue that the McDonald's is specifically Hungarian, or the McDonald's is specifically Cameroonian, or it is specifically Polish, but it is not. So I would like to support David's argument that we have to be very careful and cautious talking about these issues, trying to move away from the previous orthodoxies. I just would like to also emphasize these three layers of national, transnational, and local, that this is intersecting. And as a political strategy, this fight can be only won if these three layers are actually somehow cooperating and not only waiting for Brussels to save Europe from the different bad influence happening, but rather having this fight fought on the national level as well. So this was one kind of comment I wanted to make to David, which is connected to the issues of different layers and the different institutionalization. The second is, but David already mentioned this term I coined, these polypore institutions. And I think this is something which we should spend some minutes, because if we understand this phenomenon, then we understand my first point, which is that there is this very systematic building of a new world order. And this polypore, before the listeners start Googling what polypore is, this is this mushroom which lives on the trunk of the tree and uses the energy and the sources from the tree and produces nothing else than the polypore. This is this mushroom. And I'm absolutely aware of the biologized character of this metaphor, but as far as the modus operandi is concerned, this helps us to understand also the higher educational policy. This term we coined together with Verónica, and the polypore institutions are basically mirroring. They are parallel institutions to the already existing institutions. I already mentioned one institution in my speech, this lavishly funded university at the picturesque city of Sümeg, and also these parallel institutions are also lavishly funded, and there is only one criteria who can be employed in these institutions: the loyalty to the regime and being totally uncritical to what has been said. So in these institutions, the salaries are 2-3 times more than in the defunded public universities. And these universities are actually, and that's the main point, are showing up on the doorsteps of different European funding agencies saying that please fund us. And since the whole Hungarian higher education had been privatized now, so the 240,000 students, only 20,000 is now in the state institutions. So all this privatization is happening parallel with this polyporization of the higher education. So on the one hand, you have got this so-called change of the model, which is nothing else than creating a system of institutions which are giving lavish appointments to loyal cadres. And at the same time, there are these parallel institutions which are totally independent for any kind of quality assurance system. And interestingly, nobody in the progressive side had ever thought that higher education is a business, and it's a good business. But now the liberal regimes recognize that this is not only a good business, but it's also an important place for creating loyal cadres, and also a space where you can get lots of money. So having said that, I would like to sum up what I said. One is that we should keep an eye on the building of this world order, which is, of course, influences the higher education. And secondly, more importantly, look at the, and I'm using a very controversial term, appeasement of different international higher educational institutions in cooperation with these very dubious Hungarian higher educational institutions. So that's what I wanted to say, and thanks, David, for the comment.
What we can understand by academic freedom, by my point of view, is something that is not easy to deal with, because in the case of violence against women in campuses, there's some establishment that have to that defends this academic freedom as a manner of to understand why sexual harassment happen in classrooms. So thinking or argue that sexual liberty between adults is a kind of relationship that is allowed between individuals, denied that the power relationship implied in this kind of spaces it's not something that you have to just pass away and close your eyes. I think so. It's also a very specific concept that we have to think really critically, in the sense that it's not for everything the same meaning, and it's not for all the context on all the situations around the world. So in this case, I think academic freedom implies to work with the problematic situation that the population are involved, and it implies compromise. It implies to take a part, and also to take a part is also implies a political position that is not also welcome every time. The other thing that you are asking about the argument that I tried to put in the discussion is that how we can consider the opposition about this historical structure that I try to picture. I think we are talking about different moments of the positions, because at the 70s, maybe 80s, women have to, academics, they have to fight with people they are thinking that they are occupying places that they are not for women in universities and high educations. So, but in Mexico, the things are changing. Even more women are entered into universities, and in some areas also they are going to be more and more and super the men in some careers also. So the problem is that also in programs, institutional programs that are focused on feminist and gender studies, there are also a normalization that gender studies are to be focused on women's problems or women's issues. And that's something that we have to change. And we have something that we have to face. What happened when we have men trying to understand these kind of relationships that and gender issues that they're having to work with, in order to don't put two faces of the same coin in battle, I think so. And the position is changing, and nowadays I think so. Even the conservative sector in Mexico is very careful to talk about some things, especially violence against women. That's why this thematic is really important in the academics nowadays. But it doesn't happen the same when we are talking about abortion, or it doesn't happen the same when we are talking about queer studies. So we are not. It doesn't happen the same, and the position is different. So we have to take into account what are the different phases of this kind of positions. In Mexico, the religious point, I think even Catholic Church or different ideology related to religion are very careful to point a point of view that are pointed women in a position of victimism, and it's an issue. I think we have to think carefully, because also to talk about patriarchy as a global and homogeneous and unchangeable problematic situation, we have to look very careful that also there are so many orders that try to normalize the inequalities, to maintain exclusion, to maintain inequality, to maintain judgments about people. So I think you have a very interesting questions to think about. So well, no, in this case, I just talk about violence against women as an issue that is also arose in universities, that put in a very difficult positions to the academics that are working with other thematics, and everything looks like we have to put attention to this theme, and maybe later we are going to take attention to other issues. So I don't know if I reply all your questions, but I think there's something to think about more critically about that.
Do you want to react to David's comments?
I'm not sure I got everything, because even David's questions are always very complex. But I will try to address just two things, 2 or 3. The first is gender still critical? I think yes. Gender is still critical. This is exactly the reason why there are anti-gender movement everywhere in the world. I think if gender wasn't critical, if gender wasn't carrying a vision or an idea of justice and equality, it would not be that fight everywhere in the world. So I think gender is still critical, but of course, gender need to adapt to the context and the recent development. Like I was saying in my communication, whenever there are changes in significations of gender, when we push some of the issues, for instance, that of sexual orientation, we need to also turn the light to these specific issues and address the specific challenges that are the challenges of the moment. So yes, I think gender is still critical, and we still need to think through gender. Also, is academic sufficient? Of course, no. Which explain why some of us are not just academic. We try to, I think one of the main challenge we have right now, especially in the context of Cameroon and other African countries, David, you and I, we have had this discussion before. I think the main challenges in the context of Cameroon, for instance, is how to make gender what it is. That is a civil right issue. And to do that, we cannot just rely on university. We need to bring those discussions back to where they start, which is the society. Of course, this is always challenging, because what our opponent are trying to do is always to, kind of send us back to the university, asking us to remain there. But I think we need to keep, going out of university to address those issues. Final point, is science going to save us? I'm not sure. This is a very complex question, but as you raise it, I was thinking, I'm reading a book of Yuval Noah Harari, and there is somewhere he mentioned something that I found very, very interesting to answer your question, which is that so modern societies are not societies of fact and science. They are not societies of fact and science. They are societies of narratives. This is something he said, and he explains that you can have every kind of facts and data you can try to explain, and the COVID pandemic just showed that, just exemplify that. You can do every kind of demonstration, but people keep, just relying on narratives. So I think this answers your question. We have to rely on science, but we have to build our own narratives, which is what gender studies have always been doing. And I think we need to keep doing that, to build our own narrative of justice, to build our own societies of equality, not just gender equality, but equality, which is also why when people mention feminism, they mention sexual minorities, and then they mention critical race studies. It's because gender studies have and try to bring a very different narrative. And, so we need to work scientifically, but we need to keep building this narrative. And very last point on academic freedom and mobility. I think something that is clear is that lack of international connection and resources increase vulnerability everywhere concerning academic stuff. So we need to build alliance, just the way anti-gender opponents are doing. They are building alliance. They are building transnational movements, and they are having great impact. So we need to do the same thing. We need to oppose our own alliance and our own transnational movement to what they are doing, which is what you are doing also, David, and some of us. This is what we are exactly doing right now. And you were saying the backlash focuses on the dark side, but doesn't focus on the victories and things that are changing. You are right on that, but us organizing transnationally the way we are doing is also a consequence of backlash. So there is also a positive backlash on all that. I mean, I'm making it very complex, but my idea is very simple. I think we need to keep doing what we are doing. We need to build alliance. This is very important, because the issue is global and we need a global voice to solve it. Thank you.
I have a few questions, but very one-off questions maybe. For example, for Verónica Rodriguez, preparing this roundtable, you explained to me that now, if it does exist an anti-gender movement in Mexico, the target are not necessarily academic scholars and universities. So how do you explain that? And I have another question for you. Is about the relationship between feminism and the idea or the grammar of gender. Latin America and specifically Mexico are knowing today a very new, strong, powerful feminist wave, and it seems that the university are a place to invert, but as feminists, I mean, they underline the feminist radicality and feminist project, and they are not necessarily using the language of gender. So how do you explain that, and how could you comment that briefly, because it's almost 5. I was very interested by David's questions. I have a question about still the relationship between gender studies, pluralism in gender studies, and feminism. I remember 20 years ago, the question about institutionalization was very critical. And some currents of feminist movements considered that gender was not a symbolic glue, but a grammar glue for very, very different currents of thoughts about gender equality, sex equality. I mean, it was quite difficult to build relationships with good dialogues between queer studies and materialism, feminism, for example. So in the actuality, in that context, do you think that scholars and the relationship with activism is sufficiently built and strong precisely to resist this kind of attacks? This is a question maybe for Andrea and also for Patrick.
I think it seems that in Mexico there's a power and also a new target to talk about feminism and gender studies. However, I think the things remain the same, or almost the same, because among academics, there's a huge fight. It's a kind of agenda that who prevails in this kind of order that try to build or to preserve privileges and talking about gender in well, from my point of view, is to taking into account the differences a bit among subjects of differences, different subjects, even not just women, and also in some women studies or programs of women studies, is a kind of normalization that we are talking about a women's problem. And for us to talk about feminism, and we know that this is also a critical, controversial point of view, because just to use the word feminism in an institutional program, it seems that we are going to take advantage, or to try to have some privileges from the system in institutions. That's mean in our postgraduate program. They have to wait. We have to wait more than a half year, and to justify why we wanted to call a PhD on feminism studies, and that brings us a lot of trouble, also to convince people that we are talking about a knowledge that is recognized worldwide, and not just a kind of perspective or a specificity among research. So I think it's a kind of an agenda that also in Mexico is really difficult to advance, even when we are very few people that we are into the institutions, because that's a huge problem in Mexico. We are not having opportunities to involve students in academics. They are working in the margins, and they are also in a very, very bad positions, in labor positions. So for me, to talk about gender is a problematic that also most provoked to invoke the recognition of the differences produced by an order that gives privileges to some teams, to some researchers, to some issues in academics. So that's why we're trying to change that and to talk about feminism. That even that means that we are calling troublemakers or something like that.
If you don't have time to solve all the problems in 3 minutes, I just want to support that this claim that a new narrative is needed in order to rethink and recontextualize the relevance of gender studies. Thank you.
I think connection between different trends in gender studies, to put it that way, are still to develop. We are in a very critical time, because we have a kind of time overlap, you know, and there are very global trends, but at the same times there are very specific situations, like you just said. So it's very challenging, and I can just come back to what I said before, which is that we need to keep, building those connections, and we need to keep pushing our own narrative of all this, because this is exactly what the opponents are doing. They tie all this together, even if there are specificities. And in the academic world, we tend to, divide that, and we tend to try to address specific issues. And sometimes we, and I agree with David on that, we miss the target. So we need to really work that out, that connection between trends in feminism and gender issues, but also work connection internationally. I think that's important. For me, that's the most important thing. Thank you.
Maybe it's a very naive question, so that's why I'm not very sure about what I'm going to say. But I just wanted to know, especially to ask to Andrea, Pető in Hungary, in different cases, gender studies are presented as ideological, right? Just now, Patrick said that we need to defend a narrative. He doesn't say ideology or something political, but he says a specific narrative. I just wanted to know, to what extent how do you deal with this, let's call it the narrative of the political dimension of this kind of research? And how do you react, how do you position yourself towards this blurring border between science and politics? I just want to know, in different countries, how do you position yourself? How do you respond to this attack to gender studies as an ideology? Do you appropriate this kind of critics, saying that yes, we are fighting against counter narratives with opponents? Patrick mentioned the terms of opponents, which is very, very rude in a way, So how do you react in Hungary, and if you have time, maybe in other countries, and also in France, actually, because there was a very interesting presentation in the introduction by Delphine and Marième about the French situation.
I just want to, as a historian, I would like to use a historical analogy. So during the 1980s, one of the members of the dissent movement said that, just act as if the Soviets are not here. Just ignore them. So, and that gives a certain freedom, in a sense that, of course, then just not to react, do not take it into consideration, just follow your own star and just think about what is important for you. And of course, it's easy to say here in Hungary, although I'm at the moment I'm talking to you from Germany, but in Turkey, for example, you cannot do this because the academics are in prison, or in Russia when some of the academics are actually killed. So it's a very different context, always nationally. But my first reaction, and also a reaction of kind of self-protection, that I just don't care, right? So I mean, this is creating a space and thinking about what is important for me, and how do I personally react to these issues. So at the moment, somebody reacts to this whole narrative, which was exactly created not to be able to counteract in a meaningful way, then you are just on the losing side. So when this whole gender debate was happening in Hungary, I very consciously rejected that kind of press invitations when there was the for and against type of invitations. And I always insisted on that intellectually this is unattainable, this kind of position. So I would say that, as I said in the talk, that gender studies became a popular science, which means that there are several layers of the knowledge production, and also that gender studies had been always very closely connected with the activism, because what we want is change, because this word is horrible. I mean, all of us, only for this 1%, even this 1%, if you had the chance to talk to those who are extremely rich, they are always full of complaints, right? So what I would say as a response to this very interesting question is that it has a tactical element, a mental health element, a strategic element, and a kind of academic intellectual element. So, and we should not mix all these different layers, because then it's slightly problematic. So I would say that there is not such a thing as objective science. We all know that. And unfortunately, those who are attacking gender studies, they are attacking the whole post-constructivist approach to science and everything which has been done in the field of science in the past 300 years. And they want to go back very consciously to the time when Thomas Aquinas was the most important point of authority. And for this, you can have very different reactions. I mean, some of my colleagues refuse to take part in public debates. They are just continue publishing in peer-reviewed journals. You can do that. Some of my colleagues are getting extremely political and going out and organizing events and mobilize with students. You can do that. But you can have very different reactions depending on your personal and mental abilities. What you cannot do is just to exhaust yourself. You cannot be sad, depressed, exhausted, because that's already the victory of the illiberal polypore state, which sucked your energy, and then you remain there as an empty shell. So therefore, the most important way of resistance is just to be happy and to be, consistently following your star, what you think is good. And there are several institutions and structural spaces to do that, because of course you can say, Andrea became this kind of advocate of the self-help and whatever. No, but I'm actually is an advocate for reconceptualizing the importance of body as a site of resistance and taking care of your own body and your own mental health. Because if you don't take care of that, then it's already a victory for the liberal state. Thank you.
In short words about the situation in France. I think the situation is quite different in France in comparison to Hungary. There are threats, there are not prohibition, and the threats are related to threats to post-colonial studies, decolonial studies, studies on racism. So it is not, gender studies are not attacked by few members of this actual government as such. They are attacked in their relation with decolonial and racism studies. So I think one of the way to protect these gender studies and keep on with our studies, it's to defend plurality and to defend the seriousness of our work. And science won't save us, but science can be a good support to argue that we are doing social sciences. David Paternotte disagreed with the idea that gender studies are not attacked as such.
I would say what's happening in France is just the local variation of a global phenomena. You need to think transnationally. I mean, I'm ideas of things about working on that in the future, but what you see really is the same sort of attacks everywhere. Post-colonial studies, blah, 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 also attacked in the UK at the moment, they're also attacked in other places. And what you see, you have basically the same arguments and the same organizations behind, and then all these things live their own life in a sense that once they are in the debate, they just leave alone. The best example is political correctness. Political correctness is a term invented by the US right-wing groups already decades ago. That was all produced by think tanks. We can identify them. The history has been written. Today, it is used by everyone and anyone, but at the same time, it keeps repeating the original message. The original message is partly changed, but I think in that sense that it's not, you're right, it's not exactly gender in France, but I think that really the French case is just, I mean, to be really honest, I think that Elisabeth Badinter or Caroline Forest or Elisabeth Roudinesco are what we called in French the stupid idiots. And just repeating the same sort of things without knowing actually what they're repeating. And for instance, I would have loved someone from the right wing, but they're not going to do it for obvious reason, to sue Caroline Fourest for her last book, because it was just plagiarism of right-wing books. And someone attached to, about cultural appropriation. The book is crap, that's one thing. But the second thing, she's just plagiarizing. And I see Andrea says, yes, we have seen that a lot on anti-gender things. You have the real thinkers, it's about 4 or 5 real people. Gabrielle Kubi that she mentioned is one of them. And then you have all the people with no single regional ID, and you have them in all languages, in all countries. They just keep repeating the same things, often without mentioning the sources. But there's nothing new. And I see exactly the same phenomena around academic freedom. You see the same sort of attacks. I mean, the thing about, is research too ideological? The Danish debate that you mentioned is the same. The British debate is the same, the French debate. And so in that sense, I think that what you're right, it's not gender directly, although you have all the thing about inclusive writing. And it started from there. If you look at the Observatoire de Décolonialisme and one of these right-wing groups, you have mostly linguists. Mostly about this.
Yeah, I agree, but I think institutionalization of gender study is recent, is precarious, but its existence is unprecedented. So gender is not targeted now as such because they can't do that. It's complicated to do that as they did maybe in other countries or in France when it was only a target as an ideological. Let me finish. But I think it's a support. So the question of racism, migrations, or a support, and gender is always attacked. I don't think that gender is not attacked, but it's quite more difficult now to attack in France. I'm speaking about France as such. Because it is true that it's precarious, recent, but it is institutionalized. You don't have, well, hopefully attack again Institut du Genre. Institut du Genre is an institution where you have a pluralism about gender studies. So I don't think, I'm not absolutely optimistic, and that's not my point. My point is how there is a recomposition of this anti-gender or anti-gender studies movement.
I would just say even Sandra Logier, so the head of the Institut du Genre, was saying last week that she couldn't write things she was writing 5 years ago. So this is true. There is support. There is institutional support. There is definitely, I mean, it's more institutionalized, but still, I wouldn't be too optimistic. And to be honest, I'm more and more pessimistic. And I think especially in France, I think France, the shift of the public debate in France is really worrying, and it is going very fast, which frightens me especially.
It frightens me too.
I was arguing in my paper that this is a global phenomenon, and it really depends on the national context and the institutionalization of the gender studies and the state in which the higher education is, how effective and who are the main targets. But this is, again, like the McDonald's. So you cannot really say that the McDonald's is really French, although they may be serving a different type of French fry, right? So, and that's why this only in France, only in Slovakia, I mean, these kind of arguments are really not helpful. The methodological nationalism is really not helpful in fighting against this. Thank you.
Yes, that's why we wanted to organize precisely international roundtables to be able to see far than national methodologism. So, thank you for the last comment. Well, we just thank you a lot again.
Yeah, and
thank you very much.
Let us applaud all our participants, and especially